Recording. I love the floating thumbs. Those are so fun. All right, I'm officially starting recording for posterity. First thing that we have to do is go over the quiz that you guys did, the first formative assessment, which we had extra time to do because of all of the levels of uncertainty. That went very well, I'm happy to say. And I figured out how to make the meeting stay visible. There we go. Oh, show meeting. Hide controls. There we go. All right. Can you all see the screen share? Should be Canvas. Excellent. So far, so good. Let me make sure that the recorder is picking up the right screen as well. Can someone say hello just so I can test the audio on your side?
Hello.
Perfect. Thank you so much. All right. So I just wanted to roll through these real quick in case there were any questions, but it looks like folks were mostly able to locate the right answers. So question 1 was asking about favorite flavor of ice cream. You could also say that this was a correct, incorrect kind of question because strawberry, chocolate, and vanilla are all correct answers and mint chip is incorrect. So besides nominal, I would also accept that as another format, but that wasn't one of the choices. So the key idea here is that even in your data set, if these are represented as numbers of like 1, 2, 3, 4, they're not numbers, and we can't treat them as such. Next one. Another survey question asks about how often you watch movies from a fixed set of choices. Everybody identified this correctly as ordinal. That is a type of variable in which there is an undisputed order, but the distances between categories are maybe a little squishy because they're not really numbers either. Number of siblings. So this one, after I looked at it, I realized that it could be interpreted a slightly different way. If you thought about having a half sibling, then that's not technically a whole number, but I don't think of halves as types of people. So you have so many siblings and they are whole numbers, which would make this a quantitative variable, but not continuous. In this class, the outcomes that we are predicting, and we'll talk more today about vocabulary in terms of how to describe variables in your analysis as either predictors or outcomes. The outcomes that you're predicting should be quantitative, meaning the numbers mean something, and plausibly continuous. And so this is the vocabulary word I introduced, a year ago, whenever we met last. It was continue-ish instead of continuous, and that means people pretend, but it's not really. What kind of samples? Now this one had a few more folks picking one of the distractors of samples nested in groups. The general linear model is designed for samples of independent persons, meaning no two people should be more related to each other in terms of their outcome than any other two people, or that you have the reasons they would be related in the model. So for instance, if I'm doing an experiment and I have a control group and a treatment group, people from the same group might be more related to each other in terms of what their outcome ends up being. But once we put in a predictor variable for which group they're in, you've essentially controlled for that extra source of relationship, and then they should be independent. Samples of persons nested in groups would be addressed by a related family of models. They're known as multi-level models, or hierarchical linear models, or mixed effects models. All of those words mean the same thing. And I am hoping, not certain, but hoping to teach a course on that in the fall, for which this would be an acceptable prerequisite. Because in the world of education, y'all have clustered data. It's always students nested in teachers nested in schools, and schools are nested in districts, etc., etc. So there are these natural groupings that we have to pay attention to in building an analysis plan. But that's down the road. The good news is that everything you learn this semester is a building block for those additional levels of complexity. So, doing okay so far? Any questions? All right, rolling right along. Oh, this one. Okay, by definition, 50% of the sample must be below the mean and 50% above the mean. What do I mean instead of mean?
Median.
There we go. Yep. Those are not the same. They're both versions of middleness, but they're not the same. And later questions will focus on situations in which they would not give you the same result. What does a standard deviation indicate? Everybody nailed that. The average discrepancy from the mean. Today we are going to be introducing a vocabulary term that is related and sounds like it's a synonym, but it's not. And that is standard error rather than standard deviation. So just some foreshadowing there. If a variable's variance is 9, what's its standard deviation? Again, everybody nailed that. Very good. Standard deviation squared is variance. Now this one had some variation here. In computing standard deviations and variances, which comes first? It has to be variance. Because in order to get the average offness and not lose that because of differences in sign, we have to square things. So we take the average offness from the mean, we square it, and then sum and divide by n minus 1 to find variance, and then we can find the square root, which is the standard deviation. It's funny because when you're trying to describe data, standard deviation is a lot more understandable. It's like, oh, how far off on average is somebody from the mean? 3? Okay, I know what to do with that. But if you say, well, your variance is 9, it's like, what do I do with squared units? Like, that's a lot less intuitive for folks. So even though standard deviation is arguably more useful descriptively, we have to start with variance just based on how it's computed. All right, the skewness questions, those went well as well. If a variable's mean is greater than the median, it must be positively skewed because the mean is being pulled by the extreme values, so this kind of distribution. It's named backwards from how you would think it is. The name goes with where the tail goes. And if the variable's mean is lower than the median, then we get that's negative skew in the opposite direction. And your first homework had 2 questions about this. GPA was an example of a variable with negative skewness because we had lots of smart people in the sample who got into college. And I believe age was the one with positive skewness because you have a certain, basically like a clump of folks, and then you have some kind of tail after that. By the way, not everyone has completed homework, and so I can't go over that as a group, but you should be able to look at your scores. I also updated grades this morning on the front login page of the portal so you can see where you're at. And if there's any questions that you want to go over, please let me know and I can talk to you individually about those. Okay, then we get to the R section of the program. So I wrote these questions specifically for points that I've gotten questions about in the past, like the little things that trip people up. So I'm hoping that by having to answer the questions that you'll have some memory if you try to make one of these mistakes, like, oh, wait, she said no, you have to use this symbol instead. We'll see. So RStudio is what we open directly. It is essentially an interface to using R. It is one of many, many choices. So you can also run R from inside, Posit, I think is one. There's a new one. My husband uses a different one, VS Code. I want to say maybe there's like 5 of them, point being. Like there's a bunch of different interfaces that you can access R to. RStudio is the one that I know the best. It's like the simplest because it's not meant to be a one-size-fits-all type of package. And it does make using R a lot easier. If you just pull up R directly, it looks like a DOS prompt. Like if you remember what computers in 1985 look like, that's it. So you don't want to do that. You want to have RStudio so you can visualize your data. And if you haven't already done so, you can use, what is it called? Hang on. The thing that completes your code, Copilot. In R, you can load a GitHub Copilot account and it will complete phrases once it understands your coding style. So once you get going with this and you know how to do things and you're looking to save time, I would highly recommend that as a tool. At first, it isn't helpful because sometimes it gets it wrong. Basically, it's trying to anticipate what you're trying to do. And if you don't know what you're doing yet, then you don't know that it's wrong. So I can share resources about how to do that. I was able to sign up for a free GitHub account using my Clemson email for educational purposes. Then you can use Copilot and sign in RStudio, and it will help complete your code so you have less typing. In terms of using R, each time that you open R, you do not have to re-download packages. That's a one-time deal. There is an option within RStudio to check to see if any of the packages have been updated and to download the most recent versions, but that's an optional step. You do, however, have to load the packages. So the only thing that is available to you just when you open RStudio is base R functions. Anything that users have created specifically for their own purposes, we have to load as libraries. And whenever I build an example, whether it's in lecture files or example files, I will always have the packages first in code to check to see if they're installed, install if not, and then load. That way you don't have to try to keep track of what packages you have, although the software will tell you that as well. Let's see. almost there. When referring to variable names, package names, and functions, watch your capital letters. Did I tell you this story? I feel like I told, maybe it was in the video. Remembering? Yeah, I got stuck on R code one time, could not figure out what was wrong. The error messages are completely unhelpful, as you may have determined. Completely. And I asked my husband once he woke up, before he even had coffee, he comes and looks at my screen. Those are capital letters. Walks back. It's like, yes, they are. And I'm an idiot. So if any of you felt frustration in getting acquainted with R and its code, hi, I'm a member. Join the club. Capital letters and lowercase letters. I tend to write things in title case when possible, and so I'm used to having to pay attention to that, but you can make your own conventions in naming data sets and variables. Like if you don't want to ever hit the shift key, you don't have to. You can just write everything in lowercase. Let's see, comments. So what symbol is used to start a comment? It is indeed the #/ Just in case you're curious, the distractors are valid answers in other software. So the // is how you write a comment in Stata software, which is very popular in other disciplines. The exclamation point is for M+ software, which does structural equation modeling and multi-level modeling. And a star is used in SAS, SPSS, and Stata. So each language has its own way of doing this. You just have to figure out what its is. And I highly, highly recommend comments in your files for future you to make sure that you can remember not only what you're doing, but what purpose it served in that moment. Multiple R commands can be separated by semicolons. That is true in a number of languages as well. And what symbol is used to separate them? Commas. So inside functions, meaning a command and then followed by a set of parentheses, the pieces of information that you have to serve it are called arguments to the function, and those are separated by commas. And one nice thing about RStudio is that it will check your code to make sure you haven't missed any commas, and it will make a red angry sign in the margin where you have, or if you're off balance with your parentheses, like you have too many on one side, it will flag that as well. So if you see red next to your code, don't ignore it. That's RStudio trying to help you fix it. Notation, and this one will show up today. If we're using notation, how do we know something's a variable? It will have a lowercase I. And I apologize that one of these answers was just blank. I screwed that up and I tried to fix it. Wow, that's a big dog. I tried to fix it and it was like, this is going to screw up all the answers. Are you sure you want to fix it? And I was like, yeah, okay. So I sincerely apologize for that. I will try to be more careful in the future. But the subscripts is how you know. So any variable in this class will have an I subscript. In more advanced models, because it could vary over different dimensions, subscripts are really, really important to keep track of. So we're going to introduce them straight away. And last but not least, I think, yes, the mean of a nominal variable is useless. And all software will be happy to give it to you. Because if it doesn't understand something is not really a number, it will act as if it's a number. So it depends on how the data are stored within the database. In R, there is a category of data called a factor variable. And it looks like a string, but it's still internally stored as a number from what I understand. So sometimes if you work with R datasets directly, they will be pre-formatted that way. But in a lot of other instances, if you download data from public sources or you output it from things like Qualtrics, then you have to do the mapping of what 1 means, what 2 means, and what 3 means in some other deliberate way. So there we have it. Any questions or comments on that? How did homework 1 go? Okay enough? I didn't get a lot of emails, so that was what I was hoping. But
You're welcome.
but hey,
we emailed back and forth several times until I finally had the eureka moment.
yes, and that is okay because it's always something silly. Like you had, can I just use you as an example since you're volunteering that you asked me? So I received an email that had an error message in setting the working directory. And the error message said like not found or can't do it or something very unhelpful. And what the error was not really an error from a user's point of view. Rather than just putting in the path to the folder where the data file was stored, this student added the name of the file in the extension. Well, that's completely logical because you're thinking, here's the data set I need to work with. I need to tell it what the data set is. But that's not what the set WD, set working directory, does. It wants to know the folder. And that's actually really convenient because then you can shortcut, like you can have multiple data sets in the same folder. You can have it output things to that folder. And so it's a location, not a file. And that's just like a small difference that, once you solve that, then you're home free. And if you find yourself fighting with R for the same error message for like 15 minutes, stop and send me an email. Like, because past that point, I don't think it's going to likely be solved without great frustration, and I want to minimize that for you. So that's just an example of something tricky. Yeah, were there any other issues that trip folks up at first? Looks like everything got solved though. No, we're good? Okay, cool. Well, my task is to minimize that aspect of this class. Like, I don't want you fighting with R as the purpose. I'd rather you learn the models, and so I'm going to show you functions and things that I've built to make it as direct as possible so that we can focus on just what you're actually supposed to be interpreting. All right, so then heading back into our schedule, we're going to work through Lecture 2 today. So if you haven't already downloaded that, here's the PDF that we're going to be working through. And the files that go with it, you don't need to print or otherwise necessarily do anything with. They're for your reference. But all of the analyses that I reported as examples in Lecture 2, I wanted you to have the code and the output as to where that came from, as well as the data. So it's the same data set we started playing with in Lecture 1, and we'll continue through several of the next lectures as well. So can we take a look at that? That work? All right. Let me get... Yeah, go for it.
I do have a question. In our syllabus currently, it says that FA3 will be due next week.
Yes.
Will we be jumping to FA2 instead, or?
My thought was I put those both in there because we're a week behind. And my thought was we would see how far we get in class today and what would need to be covered potentially in a video. But if it feels like it's too much to do two at once, then I can pivot. I will likely have you do both of them so that I can keep everything consistent, but just shorten how many questions are in them. To that end, I do want to give you a heads up as to one question that you might not be expecting. It is an open response question, and you get your points for answering it. I would like to know what your theme song is. So, walk-up music. Like, if you're going to enter the game or the arena or the theater, people play music for you, what's your song? That's what I want to know. And I don't care if it has profanity. I don't care what language it's in. I'm just trying to get to know folks and honestly get to know some new music. I'm old, and I'm actually really old when it comes to music. I listen to my parents' music. Like, I'm in like the Billy Joel, Elton John, Eagles, like when I'm coding or something, like that kind of easy listening. Yacht rock. I know that's a sort of a derogatory term, but that's where I'm at. So if it happened past like 1999, I probably haven't heard it. So I like to get suggestions from my students as to what their walk-up music would be. And if you are so willing, if you can put a link into YouTube, I will build our class a playlist so you can get to know other folks' walk-up musics. I would say that there's no incorrect answers on this, but once someone put down Christmas music, and I was like, no, I'm sorry, I cannot accept that. You cannot have, your entrance to the game to be Silent Night. Like, that's just no. So anything else is fair game, though. But I will, once we get through today, I have them ready to go, but I didn't release them yet so I could see where we were at. I will let you know for sure over email what is expected of you before next week. Does that work? Answer question? Okay. Then, now I'm trying to get back to the beginning of my PowerPoint since I was checking to make sure it was going to show correctly. All right. Why is that thing floating in the middle? Get out of the way. There we go. That looks better. Okay, can you all still see me and hear me okay? And the slides? Excellent. Sometimes Zoom's recognizes my hand gestures and will shut my camera off or some random stuff like that. So if that happens, I did not mean to. Please let me know. All right, so general linear models with one predictor to start with. So this lecture, theoretically, based on what, so I have access to the first stats class you would have taken last semester, all those materials, and I look through them. I believe that you've seen all of this before. So this is still meant to be a review. It was meant to be week 2, but here we are in week 5, so we're going to make it work. If not, though, then it's a good thing for us to go over it together and try to get on the same page with respect to language, notation, and all that good stuff. All right, so the bigger picture of what I hope you're able to start doing by the end of this class is analysis of quantitative data. I'm guessing many folks here are already familiar with qualitative data. Can I get some representation from the qual folks? Okay, that's a lot of you. I know nothing about qualitative data, by the way, just for the record. So I'm kind of on the same page as you with respect to learning a brand new methodology in that regard. But what I want you to be able to do is to not be afraid of a data set, to be able to get started at least in describing it, and to be able to talk with somebody, if needed, about what else would be needed in terms of models to analyze your data. So this is the entry point. So the process is more iterative than one would think. Enter, download, or otherwise get your data. So that's always, I'm sort of starting from the point assuming that you have it. If you want to talk about research design or those kinds of questions, I can, but that's less of an emphasis than I believe what the course is supposed to be about. Importing the data and making sure it's accurately imported, this can take a really long time. So I don't want to give you any sort of illusion that like all data will be very well behaved from the start. I've been doing statistical consulting work for almost 30 years, and do you know how many times a data set that I was given, someone said it's ready to be analyzed, actually was? Any guesses? Goose egg. Yep, never, hasn't happened yet. So the process of preparing data and doing all the things to it to ensure that it's accurate and that you have the information built out of like making new variables and things, that can take a long time. Once you think you're there, though, using univariate descriptive statistics to make sure that things are in range is really important. So for instance, if you see the minimum of a scale score as -999, odds are good that's a missing data code that should not be in there because most scale scores don't have negative numbers. Then we would try to select a family of models based on the variables of interest and what kind they are, as well as the questions to be answered. And this is the part that requires, I think, potentially feedback and discussion with other folks to make sure that the way you're planning your analyses actually do answer your questions. So we would estimate the models that you decide on, check the results for problems, do that again, iterate. It's never the case that there's a model and you write it up. Like that's just never happens. And by the way, in writing, just a few words that I want you to know as new vocabulary. A lot of folks would say we ran an analysis. That's fine in informal discussion, but in writing, you would want to say that you conducted analyses or you estimated models. And also you wouldn't use calculate. Like that word doesn't work in most of these settings too, because a lot of the things that you'll learn are not things you can calculate by hand. They're solved iteratively. So we estimate models, we conduct analyses. In terms of vocabulary, a lot of different disciplines use different words for the same idea. So I just want to put us onto the same page with respect to the way that I'm going to talk about variables and the way you may have heard them in prior classes. So in determining the role of X and explaining Y, like that's sort of like generic notation, what would we call X and Y? So to me, an X variable is a predictor. It is something that we think impacts something else, even if we don't have the type of study that can establish causality. You may also hear the term exogenous. I tend not to use that word because I don't like it, but a mnemonic that I've developed, exogenous goes with X variable, as opposed to Y variable, which is the thing that you're trying to explain. So how does behavior predict results? How do actions predict this? Like that kind of thing. If the thing that's being predicted, that's a Y variable. And endogenous is the terminology that you'll hear for that. I think of it as like in my head, I have a box representing my X variable and then an arrow going into a box representing my Y. Like the arrow's going into the Y, and that's how I remember that terminology. Predictor and outcome is what you'll hear me say. Because those are neutral, those do not make any sort of claims about what kind of variable it is, whether it's measured or manipulated. But in experimental settings, you will hear additional words for these. So the term independent variable, or IV, have you heard that one before in research? Yeah. Like if you're in control of it, like if you assigned people to treatment or control groups, you would consider that an IV. But from a mathematical perspective, in terms of how you'd put it in a model, it doesn't care whether it was manipulated or measured. The corresponding term on the y side is dv for dependent variable or response variable. And covariate is the last one. This one has an interesting connotation. In some contexts, a covariate means a continuous predictor that goes alongside your IV to control for extraneous variance. So for instance, if you have a treatment group and a control group, and you know from prior research that the treatment tends to work better on older people or younger people, you might put in age as a covariate. In social sciences, the term covariate is often used in more of a derogatory way. It means a predictor that you have to put in your model because someone's going to yell at you if you don't, but you don't care about it. So in a lot of disciplines, there's variables that function this way. In work that I've done with Mabel Rice at the University of Kansas, she studies specific language impairment, which is a condition in children. It continues into adulthood, in which they have no deficits or delays, but for whatever reason, grammar is just really hard for them. Like they just have a block on that. And in that field, if you don't have mother's education in the model, no one's going to read your paper. Like that's a standard. So Mabel isn't necessarily interested in the effect of mother's education on language, but Mabel is interested in getting her papers published. So she's going to put that in there and make sure that she's covered that ground. So I think of it as like today's covariate was last decade's finding, like things that are established in the literature that are part of the model because research has shown repeatedly they should be. For instance, if you're studying, let's see, child outcomes, you might control for SES somehow, like whether the child qualifies for free lunch or something like that. Can you think of examples from your world that work like that? Covariates that you just have to have as part of your story, even if they're not personally interesting? In cognitive aging, age works the same way. Before you can talk about anything related to cognition, you have to control for their actual chronological age, or no one will listen to you. So that's what covariate means. Criterion is another one here that is used as a synonym for the y variable. So let's try this. I've got some questions here. I'd like us to play along and see, based on the question, if we can identify which variables are functioning as predictors, which are functioning as outcomes, and what kind of variable it is likely to be given how the question is phrased. So for instance, is it binary, ordinal, nominal, or quantitative, something like that. To do so, I would like to go to the whiteboard, which means I have to stop the screen share. And let's see if we can make this work. Okay, it should be starting. On this side, I'm going to make sure that lots of good answers. So number one, to what extent does positive feedback improve speed and accuracy more than neutral feedback? So I'm seeing a lot of commonality here. Speed and accuracy sound like outcomes? Yes, indeed. What kind of outcomes? Like binary, ordinal, nominal, quantitative?
Quantitative.
Yeah, I call them quantitative. Accuracy has the potential more so than speed to be continue-ish because you have boundaries at either end of that. And so any model that predicts accuracy, especially in samples where there's a whole lot of folks on one side of the distribution or other, like there's a floor effect or a ceiling effect, then your model would need to understand that it can't predict past like 0% correct or 100% correct. So that's just one thing to keep in mind as a potential wrinkle in doing that kind of thing. Feedback, what kind of variable does that sound like? Categorical is what I'm seeing everywhere. Binary, more particular, yes. So there's only two kinds of feedback as far as the question is concerned. number 2, I saw a few comments like, yeah, I don't know about this one. Number 2 is actually an example of a not great phrased research question. It is. Is faster academic growth in elementary school related to more frequent reading to children when in preschool? So what's the predictor in the story on that one? We have reading to children in preschool, reading frequency. Yeah, so more frequent reading. Based on that, we don't have a clear sense as to how the variable is measured. It could be an ordinal scale, never, sometimes, often, always, or once a week, twice a week, something like that. Or it could have some kind of reading log, something that's a little bit more continuous. In terms of outcomes, we have faster academic growth. My question to you, growth in what? Academics? Exactly, right? So this one is ambiguous as to what is actually going to be changing. Like ideally you would want to put some more nouns in the sentence, like as to what you're referring to. But also there is a hidden predictor in that question. Let me see if I can find responses that include that. One is closest, I think, pace of academic growth. In order to measure growth, what do you need in terms of a research design?
A baseline.
You need a baseline. At a minimum, you need some kind of pre-test, post-test. So this needs to be a longitudinal study in which time itself is one of the predictors to measure growth. That is my main area of research in quantitative methods. I specialize in longitudinal analyses and multi-level analyses. And I can tell you that 2 time points is never enough. Pre-post is not going to give you what you need if you really want to measure growth. More is better. And there's a whole lot of literature on that I can point you towards if that's something you're interested in. But yeah, in this example, there is time is one variable. That's a predictor that's sort of hidden in the question. Frequency of reading is another, and this actually points to what is known as a moderation question, in which time and frequency of reading would need to be fitted as an interaction. The idea that if you read more frequently, that changes the slope for time beyond just the outcome. We'll get to that by the end of the semester within cross-sectional designs, interactions and moderation questions. Number 3. So any thoughts or comments on the first 2? I'm trying to make sure I'm looking at all the answers here. Okay. Number 3. This one is also meant to be a little bit tricky. How effective is teacher training for creating higher rates of positive feedback to a teacher's students? Oops, there we go. So in this one, what's our predictor? We have training question mark, teacher training. Do we know what kind of variable that is? Not really. It could be training or not. It could be amount of training, like how many sessions you went to as a participation amount. So that's another one that's not worded super clearly. But teacher training is meant to be the predictor. Now, higher rates of feedback to the teacher's students. That would be the outcome, right? But who is the outcome measured for as worded that way? The teacher or their students? I meant it to be students. Is it possible? Let's go with some of you are teachers, or many of you or have been or will be. Do you give the same amount of feedback to all the kids? Probably not. The ones who need more correction probably get more of it, potentially. So there is likely to be variation among the students that are getting feedback from the same individual teacher. So this is an example of a multi-level design in which the predictor is a teacher characteristic, how much training they're receiving or whether or not they got training, But the outcome is a student characteristic at a lower level of analysis. And you can do that, but this is an example of when you would need an alternative analysis strategy of multi-level models to be able to properly answer that question, because the model needs to understand that the feedback that comes from the same teacher across those students is likely to be, those students are more related than students that come from different teachers. So it gets a little tricky sometimes, but hopefully this gives you a sense as to research questions don't necessarily follow like one strategy in terms of how you would phrase them. It's not always does X predict Y. Sometimes it's worded backwards, and so it takes a little bit of digging to try and figure out exactly what was meant. So thanks for playing along. Let me go back to the other side of the story here. I wish we could have whiteboard and that at the same time, but apparently that's just too much to ask for. Maybe I need a third monitor. Participants can now see my screen. Well, that's good because that's what I wanted them to be able to do. There. Okay. More a little bit of vocabulary language to start things off here. Types of inference. So if we find a relationship between X and Y, X is a predictor, Y is an outcome, what can we say about it? And I came from old school like psychology experimental tradition. The graduate program I enrolled in was actually called experimental psychology, and it had a cognitive track and a quantitative track. And this was like drilled into our heads that three things had to be true in order for you to use the verb cause in research. X has to come first. X has to be under complete control. So random assignment to groups plus manipulation. Now, those two can occur in certain situations, but in educational contexts, I think it is far more likely that you don't have things under complete control because you're working with real people in real systems. But the third one is the trickiest one. Study design eliminates all possible alternative explanations, and that's very difficult to do in practice, especially with people. Now, if you're going to do research on like cells or amoebas or rats or things where you can control everything, you might have a better leg to stand on. But people are hard. So just as an example, does smoking cause cancer? Well, it kind of seems like it does. Like there's a whole lot of evidence that maybe smoking is related to bad outcomes. But to establish a causal design, you'd have to take brand new babies and assign them to be smokers or not smokers and follow them through life, and the IRB is never going to let that happen. So there's a lot of things that we can't use the word cause. But what we can do instead is something that is known as statistical control. It's like, let's try to throw everything in the model that could be an alternative explanation and see if this X is still related to Y after factoring in all of these things. So we can say that X relates to Y or X is associated with Y. I will use the word X predicts Y in the context of which way the model goes, but we can't ever say cause. And I'm just going to operate under the assumption that this is the world that we live in, and association is pretty much as strong as you can get. So I will tend to use associative language on purpose because I don't want to imply any kind of causality. There is a whole field of quantitative methods known as causal inference that focuses on workarounds in situations with real people in which you can't control everything. So things like propensity scoring, for instance. So a few of you are nodding on that. So write that down as something to ask the Google about if you're interested in doing quasi-experimental designs. There's a field in which you can get further towards that end of causal inference, but I don't think you can truly ever get there with real people in real situations. So we're going to do associations instead. All right, so moving on to linear models then. That's what this course is about, regression and general linear models. Research questions concerning more than one variable at a time are usually best answered with models, and the models come in different flavors or families, so to speak, based on what kind of outcome they're trying to predict. So in our world this semester, we are focusing on continuous outcomes that are quantitative, and that's the family of general linear models. It turns out that term was coined, I believe, in 1968 by Jacob Cohen, because he wrote a paper that has since become very important about how ANOVA, analysis of variance models, and regression models are actually the same thing, and he showed the math to demonstrate it. And so to him, uniting these two disparate families of models in terms of the way they were thought about and used made it general. No, it turns out that general actually has a very specific meaning, meaning that the part of the outcome that is left over, the term residual is what we will have for that shortly, that has a normal distribution. It's actually a really specific case, it's not general. Fortunately, though, you're not tied to that. If you have other kinds of outcomes, there's a family of regression models that will work for you. And this is what's known as generalized, where the ized means some kind of not normal. So this is just a list of some possibilities. I had a full course on this at Iowa that I can point you towards if you're interested. Binary outcomes, ordinal outcomes, nominal, binomial. So things like accuracy fall into that category, or counts. So the general linear model has like the core of what you would need in each of these special cases, but you have to add a couple extra pieces to make it work for data that are not continue-ish. So I just want to point that out, that it is possible, but that's not something that we're going to get a lot of time to cover. I had hoped to put it in the last 2 weeks, but now that this is week 5 and we're in week 2, we'll see how that goes. All right, so linear, more vocabulary. So general actually means specifically normal with respect to the residuals, and linear doesn't necessarily mean a line. 0 for 2 in excellent terminology. What linear means is that the predictive equation building y out of your x variables has this form. It's constant times variable plus constant times variable plus constant times variable. And so this makes it look like we're stuck with a linear prediction, but that's not the case. So for instance, if I have x1 and I have a constant relating it to y, that is going to build a straight line, either up or down, depending on the direction of the constant. But if I take x1 and I square it, and I add that in as a separate predictor, that is going to create a U-shape, or a bendy line known as a parabola. And it's still a linear model that's creating a nonlinear relationship. So linear doesn't really mean what folks often think it does. It also is the case that we are going to create binary contrasts by which to include categorical predictors in addition. So it doesn't even have to be a number that the line is for. So we are not limited at all in the kinds of predictor variables that we include in these models, and the same will be true in generalized models as well. Historically, different versions of the general linear model get called different things based on what kind of predictors are in them. So linear multiple regression, if the predictors are quantitative. It's called simple instead of multiple if there's only one predictor. Analysis of variance, or ANOVA, if the predictors are grouping variables or categories. And if you have some of both, folks might call that ANCOVA, or analysis of covariance. And the way that I approach this material is these are all the same thing. The distinctions among different kinds of categorical predictors, I think, do more harm than good. And we're going to use the same base R function called LM for linear model to do everything. And I think that that will make it easier, because then not only is it one underlying system, but you're not forced into artificial silos based on what kind of model you need. Like, you don't have to pick just what the boxes are, right, in the software. Like, you can make your own box, essentially. I started talking about food analogies last time. I'm going to refrain from doing that, but in this case. All right, so what is my general linear model? Notation. Hit me.
I have a question.
Please, please, please.
So when you're saying that
Move back.
it's not a line because you can have a parabola, you mean like it's not a straight line?
Mm-hmm.
Is that what you're saying?
Yes, linear.
Like it's linear because you can't make a prediction based off of it. Like you can't count on the predictions that come out of it. Is that?
I would say it's in a form that is this linear model form. Like an alternative would be something that has like an exponent in it.
Mm-hmm.
Then it's a non-linear type of relationship. But yes, you're correct that this linear form of equation can make a prediction line that's bendy in various different kinds of ways. And parabola is one flavor of bendy. It turns out that if you take a predictor and you compute the natural log of it, and you use that instead, that creates a bendy line that it's known as exponential. It's a line that sort of levels off. And truly exponential models are very difficult to fit, like it's very limited in software, but if you trick it that way, then you end up with a line that covers like diminishing returns, where like more isn't always better. And I think there's a lot of relationships in life that take on that form. And so that's one way you can trick a linear model into doing your bidding to make yourself a bendy line instead of a straight line. But we can always make predictions out of the equation, regardless of what kind of variables we have in there. Does that help?
I had another question.
Please.
When communicating these sorts of things, do people say, do you talk about this as like I estimated a general linear model, or do people expect reviewers, others to expect that you're articulating like, I did an ANOVA or ANCOVA or whatever?
I will say yes. It depends on the discipline. And I think that reading through papers in the journals and that you're targeting to kind of get a flavor of how they talk about things will help guide you towards the right language. But what I usually do is include parentheticals to cover my bases. Like I will say, we fit a general linear model with 2 categorical predictors and then in parentheses, i.e. a two-way analysis of variance or something. Because then you're not dependent on people recognizing the particular term that you know for your model. And that is especially the case the more complicated that you get. So words and equations, I think, the more the better to try and describe what you're doing. Other questions?
I had a question.
Yeah.
Is this kind of specific to R, or like in other programs would we have to specifically search for ANOVA or ANCOVA?
It varies by program, but in my experience, like SPSS, for instance, has like an ANCOVA box that you can go through or an ANOVA box you can go through. There is a GLM like section, but it's not taught as frequently. And then there's differences across the different, how do you call it? The different ways of asking for the same thing. So I'll use SPSS as an example because I know that one was the case. So there's a regression command in SPSS. And if you want to fit interaction terms using that command, you have to physically multiply the 2 variables together and save them as a new column. Whereas if you ask for the exact same analysis using GLM, you don't. And the same is true for SAS. Like there's a proc ANOVA versus like a proc regression. So it varies by software, but the LM function in R is a general function that covers any kind of general linear model, and most software packages have an analog to that. Is there one in particular that you're thinking of?
I was just wondering if we use another program, if we're going to be looking for anything specific.
I would look for general linear model would be the term I would search for. If that's not available, then I would say regression, because that usually would be the more general version in which you can include categorical predictors if you set them up that way ahead of time. Whereas ANOVA is going to be expecting particular combinations of things. They all have to be categorical. And then the default is that you can't have interactions among categorical continuous, even though there's no reason you can't. That's just not baked into the family of options. So this way you don't have to sort of like pick a lane. Like you can take whatever you need across the different options and combine them into whatever's going to be optimal. Okay. Thank you for the questions. Do we need a break yet, or are we hanging in there? Hanging in? I gotta say, folks, I am really impressed with y'all. I had students who like didn't have day jobs, and it felt like they couldn't hang for more than 45 minutes without looking at the clock. But this group has already been at work all day, and you're still hanging. So I'm really impressed. Thank you. Any other questions on this terminology and stuff? All right. By the way, each of my worked out examples of code and output at the end of it is going to have a sample results section as to like how I would write this for a journal. And so you can see a template as to how I would describe each of the models and what the relevant information would be to include about that. Because that's the most important part. All right, notation. So welcome. We're going to be predicting one outcome at a time. So that constitutes a univariate GLM. That's what folks mean usually when they just use the term GLM. There's also multivariate variance. That is covered in, there's a multivariate course. That's what my husband is teaching right now. He will cover those extensions in there. That would be like a next course to take after this one. But where all GLMs start is simply by recreating the mean and the variance of the outcome variable that is to be predicted. Like that's the starting point. So we will use the normal distribution as the basis for essentially the mean and the variance describe a normal distribution, so that's what we need the model to be able to recover. We're ignoring skewness and kurtosis for right now. At the end of the class, I will describe what happens when assumptions that you make are not satisfied and where to go from there. But I prefer to wait to do that because it's dissatisfying for me to not know what the solution is, just to know what the problem is. So we'll get to that point later on. But this is your very first equation. This little thing right here. And I'm using color quite deliberately. Red is things that are going to predict y, and then blue is like error of the wrongness. So this is called an empty model. It means there are no predictors in this model. So we have y sub I. That's a variable because it has a lowercase I here. This is a column in your data set that you were trying to predict that is continue-ish. We have it being predicted from this thing. This is beta. I'm going to call it beta 0. Other textbooks will call it beta naught, but I'm not going to say that. I find that confusing. And more generally, each beta is going to be called a fixed effect, which means an estimated constant that you have to know in order to predict the outcome. Fixed effects is a term that you will come across in more complex models, multi-level models, for instance, in which there are something else called random effects instead, which are not constants. I'm going to use the word fixed to describe these so that that terminology is locked down for your future selves. And the lowercase, the subscript on here for the number is just an index as to which one it is, and the first one starts at 0. So we will have beta 1, beta 2, beta 3, and so on as we add stuff to the model. So the empty model, if you don't know anything else about a person, which is what the model says, what's your best guess for what their outcome is going to be? Somewhere in the middle, like the mean, as it turns out. The term is expected value from statistics land. So you can think of it as expected or predicted, and that's the jumping off point. If we know nothing else about a person, the most reasonable guess for their outcome is the mean for the sample. So we give that same prediction to everybody as a naive starting point. So that means in an empty model, beta 0, this is my fixed intercept, is the same thing as the sample mean y bar. That's our jumping off point. More generally, the fixed intercept definition will hold across all of statistics as far as I know. It is the expected outcome when all of your predictors are 0. If you don't have any predictors, it's just the expected outcome, or the mean in this case. So you will hear a terminology, either the sample mean to distinguish it from a population mean that doesn't exist, or a grand mean. Grand is a synonym for just the mean. So I stole a picture from Wikipedia to make this point. This shows 4 alternative versions of a normal distribution that vary in their mean or their variance. And I'm changing my notation a little bit relative to lecture 1 because I decided I wanted to be more specific. The subscript that's on these is what variable it refers to. So mu is the symbol for a population mean, but this is the population mean for y specifically. Likewise, sigma, that's this thing right here, squared, is the population notation for variance of y specifically. And the height that's on this y-axis here is known as likelihood. This is the formula that gives it to you. You don't need to memorize this, I still don't. But the point that I want to make is that given the mean and given the variance, each person in the sample gets a number that describes where they are on this y-axis. So in this case, we have the 4 different lines. What would beta 0 be for the blue line based on this picture? This is a finger question, by the way. We don't even need a whiteboard for this one. What would beta 0 be for the blue line in the picture? Yeah, see, finger question. What would beta 0 be for the red line? Also 0. So what makes them different? The other one, variance. So the blue line has a lot smaller variance than the red line, which changes how many people are likely to be near the mean. So the more variance you have across your subjects or your participants, the less good of an estimate the mean is essentially going to be. It's going to be expected variability. So we have a direct way to capture how useful or good the equation is at predicting y. And that is operationalized by this little e thing here. So e sub I means it's a variable, means everybody gets one. So right now y is a variable, beta 0 is a constant, and e sub I is a variable. E stands for residual or error. Take your pick. I prefer the term residual. Some textbooks use an R there for that reason instead. This is an index of how wrong the model is for each person. It will always mean that. E is how wrong the model is. What changes is what the model says it's going to be, and thus how wrong E is. Right now, E is as wrong as it can be because everybody is getting the same prediction for Y, just the mean, as given by this fixed intercept beta 0. So E is going to be the actual Y minus the mean. That part should look familiar because that's how we compute variance. And in fact, at this point, the variability in Y in the data and the variability in the E residuals from this empty model are the same number. So the terminology that we would use for sample variance, this S squared, we're going to switch that to be population notation. This is how it's reported in most research reports. But this idea of how we started computing variance, so y sub I minus y bar, where you are minus the mean squared, that's going to be replaced by E. Because what's going to change across the models is the red part. What do we think y is supposed to be for each person is what changes as we add predictive information. The idea that E is the discrepancy between what it actually is and what he thought it should be does not change. So E is always how wrong you are. And we have n minus 1 here because in order to compute this in the first place, we had to know the mean. It's terminology that's going to be called degrees of freedom. So in other words, the two things that are being estimated, meaning found by the analysis at this point, is beta 0, which should just be the sample mean, and the variance across people of these E's. So note there's a shift in location here. E sub I is for one person. We don't care necessarily what E is for this person or that person or that person. We're keeping track of the collection of E's as deviations from what should happen. So we're going to use sigma squared E because it is the variance of the E's that we're going to pay attention to. And even though this is sort of intermixing sample and population notation, it's conventionally accepted because everyone knows you only have a sample. Like we don't ever know what the population is unless you make up the data. How would we do this in R? So I have two print commands, by the way, to make sure that in the output, they actually show up with the output. Otherwise, if you just dump the console to something, it won't necessarily be there. So that's why I'm using these to essentially insert titles. So in our structure, what I'm doing is saying, I would like LM. I would like the data set to be used to be lecture 2. So I had already loaded all the libraries, imported the data, and so it knows what lecture 2 is. It's a file. Formula is the model. So the first thing that goes after the equal sign to tell it what the model contains is the name of the variable to be predicted, your y. In this example, we are predicting income in thousands of dollars. The squiggle 1 functions like an equal sign. R already used equals for these argument assignments, so it can't do that. So it's a squiggle, a tilde, if you will. The 1 is because implicitly, what is multiplying beta 0 in this linear model is just a column of 1s. So this is referring to the fact that we have an intercept as the only thing that is predicting y at this point. If you want to shut it off, can you guess what you would do? Like for some reason you don't want a beta 0? Yeah, make it a 0, exactly. So there's a little bit of intuitiveness there. There are instances in which you would do that in multivariate analyses, but not standard and univariate. So the fixed intercept is always going to be there. And if you don't write a 1, it will give it to you anyway. I write a 1 for reasons to be described so that I don't screw something up that's later. So if you just type this much, you will get some output. If you want to do anything with that output, you need to save it as an object. So model empty is a name I came up with to save the results of this analysis in R, so that then I can have it do other calculations with it, such as compute predicted values. But if I run just this first line right here, I won't get any output. You have to ask it to print it once you've saved it. So there's a generic command that works with every single function in R that I've seen so far called summary. And this will print key features of the output that it has saved to the console. So it looks like this as just a default. So it first tells you what you asked for, and note that it's rearranging my code, so the order in which you write the arguments in here doesn't matter, so long as they are named. So I have a habit of writing data first, then model. If you want to change that around, go right ahead. But you have to name the arguments if you want to have them in a different order than the author intended. Residuals. So this is descriptive information about the e's in this case. The e's should have a mean of 0, but in this analysis they have a median that's actually negative. So that's telling us that the distribution of this variable is positively skewed. This little piece right here, I don't usually pay attention to. Coefficients. This is the answers you wanted. So intercept is what it refers to beta 0 as, and it is estimated at 17. The rest of this we will get to momentarily. So I have highlighted these two numbers because if I just ran descriptive statistics for this variable, I would get them back. Not a coincidence. So what I have here is validation that I understand my data. The mean of this variable is 17.303. That's what the value of the fixed intercept would be from an empty model. Residual standard error is 13.8, and with more precision, is down here as the standard deviation of the variable. And this is really unfortunate terminology to me because this is not a standard error in the classical sense. So just to recap, in an empty model, we start off by giving everybody the mean of that outcome as our prediction. The E of how wrong it is, the variance of those E's across people is equal to the variance of the original variable. So that's how much we had to start from. And in this data, the standard deviation, the square root of that variance, 13.8, means that on average, you would expect each person to be off from this mean of 17 by about 14 or so. So this is $17,000 in this example of income. And I don't like this terminology because I find it confusing, but I'm going to put it back onto the picture that it came from. So this is a histogram describing the distribution of annual income in thousands, where most of the folks make little money. So from an empty model, the intercept for the mean would be about here. Each person would have a residual. The variance across people of those E residuals was estimated as 190, and the square root of that is the standard deviation. So that's where we get the 13.8. That describes the variability across the people in this outcome. All right. So same ideas as you have an intro stat, just adding some additional notation on top of it that's going to allow us to grow this. Because we know that the mean is not a good answer for everybody, right? We can do better by adding in predictive information, but this is the starting point. All right, how are we doing, folks? Can I get a thumb check? Remember the scale? It goes from here all the way down to here. Sideways. We're tilting around sideways. Okay, that's fair. If you don't have your camera on, you can pick, like a poop emoji or something if you want to do the downstairs one. Do they have thumbs down in the things? We'll find out. I'm pretty sure they don't have thumbs sideways. There we go. Yeah, there's the poop emojis. We found it. So you're allowed to express yourself however feels best to you. Okay. So Next question. Related but different. And this is the part that makes standard error versus standard deviation confusing if you think of them as synonyms. We just found that in this data set, the mean is 17.3. Do you think if we redid the study, grabbed another sample of people, so there's 734 in this particular example, that the mean income of those new 734 people would be 17.3 exactly? Probably not. It's going to wiggle. We'd like to be able to anticipate how wiggly it is across samples or how much it's going to fluctuate. And that requires a new concept beyond just the distribution of a variable, but the distribution of a variable's mean across samples. So this is a different level of abstraction that we're moving to. So let's say that I can control the world. I'm going to simulate data. And this is what we do in quantitative methods, as I think I mentioned, a year ago during our first class, as to we develop data that we know the right answer, and then we can evaluate across different methods how successful we were in coming up with it. So I made a population. This is a data in SAS, but R can do the same thing. And in my population, I have 100,000 fake people. And I set the mean of that population to be 10. I set the variance to be 25, so that each person is off from the mean by an average of 5, plus or minus on either side. And I did use a normal distribution to generate it as a starting point here. So if I ask then for a summary across all the people in this population, you can see that the red line and the blue line for truth and estimate are right on top of each other. So my data simulation worked. Now let's say that from this population, I'm doing fake research on my fake people. And each time I'm going to grab a sample of people, a sample of people, a sample of people, and I'm going to do it over and over and over and over again. So what if I grabbed 1,000 samples of people and I did it at 6 different sample sizes? So the top left over here shows a sample of 5 people, each sample done 1,000 times. This one is 10 people each time, done 1,000 times. 15, 20, 30, 50. What is being shown here is not the people. What is being shown is what the mean turned out to be in each of those 1,000 samples. So what do you notice just looking across? As sample size increases, what happens to the distribution? And this can be a finger question or a typing question. I'm keeping an eye on the chat, by the way, if you want to communicate that way. Yeah, variance decreases, or it's kind of like shoved in. So the more people you have, the less fluctuation you would expect in what the mean happens to be in any one sample. It's a lot noisier. Like this sample out here of 5 people had a mean that's way off from the 10 it's supposed to be, and that didn't happen once you get 50 people in a sample, for instance. So one of the things that's going to affect how wiggly your results are across repeated samples is the number of people contributing to your sample. And more is better. That is the most common question I get is, I'm doing a study, I need to figure out how many participants I need. And you know what my answer is? More. I don't need to know any more details than that. More is better. Unless you're working with like census data, in which you might have 1 million rows in your data set, and that maybe less would be better in that case, but you don't want to dump people out unnecessarily. So this is one thing that's going to affect wiggliness across the results of repeated samples, is how many people are in each. Okay. So if I were to compute the mean of the means, so each of these bars represents the number of means in that category of the histogram. The mean of the means is pretty spot on no matter how many people I have. The mean gets recovered well. It was supposed to be 10, and it pretty much is. But the standard deviation of those means, that's what we're seeing shrink. This idea across the pictures. There's less variability in what the mean turns out to be the more people you get in each of your repeated samples. Okay, with me so far? So these are not people. These are samples. What else is going to affect how consistent or inconsistent your results are across repeated samples? Well, how much the people vary from each other. So on the left, I have the same plot of the mean of 10 and a standard deviation of 5, and I'm contrasting it with a mean of 10, standard deviation of 3. So now, if I only have a standard deviation of 3, you can see that same tendency happens even more. So the less variable the people within a sample are, the more consistent the sample mean would be across repeated samples. And it's easy to think about that if you think about how things would change based on just who you happen to pick if you only have 5 people. So let's say that you are sampling singing aptitude from the general population. And you happen to just randomly sample Mariah Carey or Whitney Houston or somebody like that. Do you think that mean of singing ability is going to be descriptive? If Mariah Carey's in there pulling the line like way into the stratosphere? Probably not. But if I had a sample of 50 people and Mariah's in there, then maybe she doesn't have as much pull on the mean because there's 49 people sort of contradicting her. So it's easier to think about how things can kind of go sideways in smaller samples because each person does a lot of the heavy lifting relative to larger samples where there's less of a chance that any one person is going to throw the thing way off. So we see that the mean is right pretty much no matter how many people you get, but the variance in those means across repeated samples is a function of how much variability there is within the people. So putting that together, left to right, the bigger the sample size, meaning the number of people in the sample, the less wiggly your sample mean is going to be across samples. The more predictable it would be, the less inconsistent. If I go from top to bottom, the more standard deviation you have within a sample, the more variable it's going to be. So if I contrast a sample of 5 people for each of these bars, and I have a standard deviation of 3 at the top versus 5 at the bottom, their means are more spread out on the bottom because each sample has more variability in it. So those are the two things that are going to affect the precision of your results. Essentially how, I'm trying to use synonyms but not say things that are wrong. Inconsistent, wiggly, fluctuating, like those are the words I want to use. So it turns out that in statistics, even though we don't have this, we sort of do. Like the only reason I was able to make these plots is because I made up the data where I know what the right answer is. In research, you don't know what the right answer is, or there'd be no point in doing the research. So you're sort of taught like this idea of a population parameter, but you can never know if you're right. So we don't have the ability to sample 1,000 times and see how inconsistent the results are, but we can approximate it with math. So some genius figured this out 1,000,000 years ago, that even though we only have one sample, we can use the results of that one sample to anticipate what the variability would be in those sample means across repeated samples, and that thing is called the standard error. So standard deviation versus standard error. Standard deviation is about the people. It describes how far off each person is from the sample mean in that sample. The standard error refers to how far off the sample result is from the population version of what the result was supposed to be. And I'm using result in a generic way because this idea holds regardless of whether you're trying to estimate a sample mean or a variance or a slope or an intercept or anything else. This is a core idea that I want to make sure we have in place. So the standard error of the mean which is our best guess for what each person gets for their outcome if we know nothing else, is computed as the standard deviation, or the y variable in the population, or we switch out the sample if that's what we happen to have, divided by the square root of the sample size. So both of these things then contribute to the standard error. If you have more variability within a sample, your standard error is going to be higher. If you have more people in a sample, your standard error is going to be lower because they work against each other in the numerator or the denominator. So putting this back onto our picture, and then I think we have, we'll take a break after that. My windows are all open. It's really weird to be teaching in the dark, but this is our lives now. So back to the picture. This is the part we saw before. So from an empty model predicting income from nothing else, beta 0 is going to be the mean of this income variable in our sample, which works out to be 17.3. So on average, people make $17,300 a year. The collective offnesses, so the variance of these E residual deviations, was estimated to be 190. The square root of that becomes the standard deviation of 13.8. So on average, any one person in this sample of 734 is going to be off from the mean of 17 by 13.8. That's describing the variability in this sample across the people. But then to answer the question, is 17.3 a good estimate of the mean, or like how much would it fluctuate? We compute its standard error. So this is a higher level of abstraction, not the people, but the samples. And it works out, given these numbers, to be 0.51. So on average, any one sample of this kind, so same people, same sample size, all that, is going to be off from the population mean by about 0.5. So that's not too wiggly. If you got 17.3, then people would do like plus or minus 1 standard error to describe the expected wiggliness of that. It means that you're somewhere between, the high 16s or the low 18s. So 17 isn't that big of a, that isn't, the standard error doesn't mean it's super fluctuating. If the standard error were 2, then you'd be like, well, the mean could be anywhere from like 15 to 19. It's a less believable estimate. So we pay attention to this in terms of the results of our analyses to help us indicate what is the expected amount of fluctuation just normally, and how does our result map onto that expected amount of fluctuation. Are we within expected fluctuation, or are we somehow deviant in a way that is unexpected? And that sort of concern leads to p-values, which is where I'm headed about 30 slides from now. Yeah, but some of the slides are question slides. And if we don't finish this all today, that's okay. All right. So, yep. Okay. One more slide, and then we're taking a break. So this is comparing the sample sizes that we had at different levels here. This is for the standard deviation of 5 condition. And I have what happened in the population, because I made up the data. I have the right answer. Across different sample sizes, we get the right mean. Across different sample sizes, we get an increasing standard or decreasing standard deviation as sample size increases. And if we shortcut this and just use that handy dandy formula that some genius made up, it kind of works. So if we use what the standard deviation was supposed to be in the population of 5, this is the value we get. If we use what it actually turned out to be in each sample, that's the S, that's what we get. And the more people you have, the closer these numbers diverge. So even though we only have one sample, we still have a way to anticipate how much variability we would get in the results across repeated samples of the same kind. It's magic. You're looking less than impressed. It's magic, I swear. Now, you can't always have the magic work. Like, the magic is predicated on certain things being true, and there are situations in which the magic does not work. For instance, the standard error of a median. There's no handy-dandy formula for that. But there are resampling kinds of ways to get to that. And that's towards the end of the semester. We'll touch on some of those techniques because they come in handy when assumptions are broken, meaning your outcome isn't exactly how it's supposed to be. All right, should we take 10 minutes or so and regroup? Would that work? Okay, I will see you at 6:25 to 6 Eastern time. One moment.